Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into something truly special, a masterpiece of historical storytelling that's been making waves across the internet. We're talking about The Miserable Life of a Victorian Leech Collector, a 20,000-word epic that takes you deep into one of history's most grotesque professions. Before we get started, if you're new here, this is where we explore the darker, stranger corners of human history, the stories that textbooks conveniently skip over. So if that sounds like your kind of content, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And as always, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what drew you to this particular slice of historical horror. Now, grab your favorite drink, maybe light a candle, and settle in somewhere comfortable, because we're about to spend some quality time with Thomas Whitmore, a man whose daily routine involved wading into swamps and letting blood-sucking parasites feast on his flesh for money. Yes, that was an actual job in the 1800s, and yes, it was exactly as awful as it sounds. This isn't just any historical account. It's written in that beautifully sarcastic, darkly humorous style that makes even the most miserable human experiences somehow entertaining. Think of it as if a medieval chronicler had a wicked sense of humor and a talent for making you laugh, while simultaneously making you grateful you weren't born in Victorian England. So dim those lights, get that ambient sound going if you have it, and let's journey together into the fated marshlands of 19th century Lincolnshire, where desperate men made their living as human feeding stations for aquatic worms. Trust me, after tonight, you'll never complain about your job again. Welcome to the 19th century, where medical science was about as precise as throwing darts blindfolded, and the height of therapeutic sophistication involved deliberately allowing parasitic worms to drain your blood. In this delightful era of industrial progress and scientific enlightenment, there existed a profession so grotesque, so utterly soul-crushing, that it made coal mining look like a spa vacation. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the leech collector, a human being whose daily routine involved wading through swamps, getting bitten by blood-sucking parasites, and somehow convincing themselves this was a legitimate career choice. Thomas Whitmore was one such unfortunate soul, though calling him fortunate would be like calling a plague outbreak a minor inconvenience. Born in 1823 in the fated backwaters of Lincolnshire, Thomas had the extraordinary misfortune of inheriting his father's leech collecting business, which is possibly the only trade where bankruptcy might actually improve your quality of life. The Whitmore family had been in the bloodsucker procurement industry for 3 generations, a legacy about as prestigious as a hereditary case of consumption. The leech trade wasn't some quaint cottage industry run by eccentric naturalists with a passion for invertebrate biology. Oh no, this was serious business, driven by the medical establishment's unwavering faith that the human body contained entirely too much blood and needed regular mechanical intervention by hungry aquatic worms. Doctors across Europe had convinced themselves that leeches were nature's own precision instruments, capable of drawing out everything from melancholy to madness, from fever to flatulence. The demand was so intense that by the 1830s, France alone was importing over 40 million leeches annually, which tells you everything you need to know about both French medicine and French suffering. Thomas began his career at the tender age of 14, which in Victorian England was considered practically middle age for starting manual labour. His father, William Whitmore, was a weathered man whose legs bore the scars of decades' worth of leech bites, creating a sort of living map of every marsh, bog, and stagnant pond within 50 miles of their village. William had the perpetually pale complexion of a man who spent his working hours being slowly drained of blood by professional parasites, and the cheerful disposition of someone who knew his son would soon share the same fate. The tools of the trade were magnificently primitive. A pair of thick leather boots that leaked more than they protected, a wooden staff for testing bog depth, and occasionally beating off territorial waterfowl, and most crucially, one's own legs, which served as both bait and storage container for the product. The traditional method of leech collection, refined over centuries of human misery, was elegantly simple. Wade into the nastiest, most stagnant water you could find. Stand perfectly still while hundreds of leeches attached themselves to your flesh, then carefully remove them and deposit them into collection jars. It was like fishing, except the fish were slimy bloodsuckers and you were the bait. Thomas's first day on the job was a masterclass in occupational horror. His father led him to Grimsby Marsh, a fated expanse of standing water that smelled like death had taken up permanent residence and started charging rent. The water was brown, not the rich brown of fertile soil, but the ominous brown of decay and things that should have been buried long ago. Insects swarmed in clouds so thick they formed their own weather system, and the occasional bubble rising to the surface suggested the presence of decomposing matter that was probably better left unidentified. Right then, Thomas, his father announced with the enthusiasm of a man announcing his own execution. Time to learn the family trade. Strip down to your underclothes and wade in slow, like. The leeches will find you soon enough. The casual way his father mentioned being found by leeches, as if they were old friends dropping by for tea, did nothing to improve Thomas's rapidly deteriorating confidence. The sensation of entering leech-infested water for the first time is difficult to describe to those fortunate enough to have avoided the experience. Imagine stepping into a bath of lukewarm soup that's been sitting out too long, except the soup is actively trying to drink your blood. The water was murky enough that Thomas couldn't see his own feet once he was knee deep, which meant he had no warning when the first leech attached itself to his ankle. The initial bite felt like a tiny pinprick, almost pleasant really, which was nature's cruel joke. Leeches, you see, inject an anesthetic when they bite, so you don't feel them latching on. It's only later, when they've been feeding for a while and have swollen to the size of small sausages, that you notice something is terribly wrong. Within 20 minutes of entering the marsh, Thomas had acquired his first dozen leeches. They hung from his legs like grotesque Christmas ornaments, their bodies gradually expanding as they filled with his blood. The psychological impact of watching parasites literally drain your life force cannot be overstated. It's one thing to cut yourself accidentally and see blood flow. It's quite another to stand motionless while dozens of creatures methodically extract your bodily fluids for their own nourishment. But the physical discomfort was only the beginning of Thomas's education in professional misery. Leech collecting wasn't a solitary pursuit where one could suffer in dignified silence. No, it was a social activity, conducted in the company of other equally desperate individuals who had somehow concluded that allowing themselves to be eaten alive was preferable to starvation. The marshlands around Lincolnshire were populated by a small army of leech collectors, each jealously guarding their own territories and competing for the best blood-sucking spots, like prospectors fighting over gold claims. The hierarchy among leech collectors was as rigid as any medieval guild system, except instead of measuring skill by the quality of their craftsmanship, they measured it by their capacity for biological self-sacrifice. Veteran collectors were easily identified by their pale complexion, their steady hands despite chronic blood loss, and their ability to estimate leech quality by feel alone. Thomas quickly learned that there was an art to leech collecting that went far beyond simply standing in water and waiting to be bitten. Different species of leeches commanded different prices, and identifying them while they were attached to your bleeding flesh required an expertise that would have impressed a trained naturalist. Herudo medicinalis, the European medicinal leech, was the gold standard, prized for its size, its feeding capacity, and its supposed therapeutic properties. These magnificent specimens could grow to 4 inches in length and drink up to 10 times their own body weight in blood, making them the Rolls-Royce of blood-sucking invertebrates. A single high-quality medicinal leech could fetch 6pence at market, which doesn't sound like much until you consider that a farm labourer earned about 10 shillings per week, making a prime leech worth roughly a day's wages. Then there were the horse leeches, larger but less valuable, because they were considered inferior for medical purposes, though Thomas never quite understood the distinction. A leech that could drain blood was a leech that could drain blood, as far as he was concerned, but the medical establishment had decided that only certain species were suitable for treating human ailments. The logic was about as sound as most Victorian medical practices, which is to say it made perfect sense to people who also believed that cholera was caused by bad air, and that the best treatment for mental illness was spinning patients in chairs until they vomited. The work was seasonal, which provided the illusion that leech collecting was merely a part-time occupation rather than a year-round descent into biological horror. Spring and early summer were prime collecting season, when the leeches were most active and the demand from medical practitioners reached its peak. During these months, Thomas would spend 6 days a week in various wetlands, arriving before dawn and working until his legs could no longer support his increasingly anemic body. A typical collecting session lasted 4 to 6 hours, during which Thomas might accumulate 50 to 70 leeches of various sizes and species. The removal process was an art form in itself, requiring careful technique to avoid damaging the creatures, which would reduce their market value. Pulling leeches off carelessly could cause them to regurgitate their blood meal, rendering them unsaleable and leaving Thomas with nothing but bleeding wounds to show for his troubles. The proper method involved using a fingernail or small knife to break the suction at the leech's mouth, then gently sliding the creature off and into a collection jar filled with marsh water. But even successful removal didn't end Thomas's immediate suffering. Leech bites bleed profusely due to the anticoagulants in the creature's saliva, designed to keep blood flowing freely during feeding. A single bite could bleed for hours, and after a full collecting session, Thomas's legs looked like he'd been attacked by a gang of tiny vampires with poor table manners. The constant blood loss left him perpetually dizzy, pale, and exhausted, creating a vicious cycle where he needed to work more to maintain his income, but was increasingly unable to perform the physical demands of the job. The transportation and storage of live leeches presented its own unique challenges. Leeches are surprisingly delicate creatures despite their parasitic lifestyle, requiring specific conditions to remain healthy and saleable. They needed clean water, adequate oxygen, and protection from temperature extremes. Thomas learned to maintain his leeches in large earthenware jars filled with pond water, changed daily to prevent the buildup of waste products that could kill his valuable livestock. The jars had to be covered with cloth to prevent escapes, because there's nothing quite like discovering that your blood-sucking inventory has escaped and is now roaming freely through your living quarters. During peak season, Thomas might have several hundred leeches in storage at any given time, each one representing hours of personal blood sacrifice. The creatures had to be fed regularly, which meant more collecting sessions and more biological donations from Thomas's increasingly depleted circulatory system. It was a business model that would have impressed a medieval loan shark, except instead of charging interest on money, Thomas was paying interest with his own blood. The market for leeches was controlled by medical suppliers and apothecaries, who purchased from collectors and then resold to doctors at significant markup. Thomas dealt primarily with Jeremiah Blackwood, a corpulent apothecary whose shop in Lincoln smelled like a combination of rotting flowers and medical desperation. Blackwood was the sort of businessman who could calculate profit margins while examining a jar of bloodsuckers without showing the slightest trace of disgust, which probably tells you everything you need to know about his character. Blackwood paid based on leech size, species, and overall health, subjecting each batch to an inspection that rivaled a military parade. He would examine individual leeches with a magnifying glass, testing their responsiveness by prodding them with a thin wooden stick. Sluggish leeches commanded lower prices, as did specimens that appeared damaged or diseased. The negotiation process was a masterclass in capitalist exploitation, with Blackwood holding all the leverage and Thomas desperately trying to maximize the return on his biological investment. The seasonal nature of leech collecting meant that Thomas spent his winters in a state of relative recovery, allowing his body to replenish the blood he donated to his professional obligations during the active season. But winter brought its own hardships, as the income from the previous season had to sustain him through months of unemployment. Most leech collectors supplemented their income with other forms of manual labor, but the chronic anemia and physical exhaustion left many of them unsuitable for demanding work. Thomas found winter employment as a grave digger, which was about the only profession that made leech collecting look appealing by comparison. At least leeches only drained your blood while you were alive. Corpses just drained your soul through the sheer existential horror of spending your days in close proximity to human mortality. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his summers being slowly consumed by parasites and his winters burying people who had probably died from medical treatments involving the very leeches he collected. The social status of leech collectors in Victorian society ranked somewhere between rat catchers and plague victims. Respectable people crossed the street to avoid them, partly due to the persistent smell of stagnant marsh water that no amount of scrubbing could completely eliminate, and partly because of the visible evidence of their profession written across their scarred and perpetually bleeding legs. Thomas learned to wear long trousers at all times, not just for modesty, but to hide the constellation of bite marks that advertised his occupation to anyone with eyes. Romantic relationships were particularly challenging for men in the leech collecting business. It's difficult to court a woman when your profession involves deliberately allowing yourself to be eaten alive by aquatic worms. Thomas's few attempts at courtship invariably ended when potential suitors learned how he earned his living. The conversation typically went something like this: "What do you do for work, Mr. Whitmore?" "Well, I stand in swamps and let leeches drink my blood." "I see. And you do this voluntarily?" "It pays the bills." "Good day, Mr. Whitmore." The physical toll of the profession extended far beyond the obvious blood loss. Standing for hours in cold, stagnant water led to chronic problems with circulation and joint pain. The constant exposure to marsh environments meant regular encounters with all manner of waterborne diseases and parasites. Thomas contracted marsh fever at least twice per season, spending weeks in bed with symptoms that would have hospitalized a person of weaker constitution or better sense. The psychological impact was equally devastating. There's something profoundly demoralizing about waking up each morning and preparing to be systematically drained by parasites. Thomas developed what modern psychologists might recognize as a form of occupational depression, characterized by a persistent sense of being literally consumed by his work. He would lie awake at night feeling phantom leeches crawling on his skin, a sensation that became so persistent he began to question whether some of the creatures had actually taken up permanent residence in his flesh. But perhaps the most soul-crushing aspect of leech collecting was the knowledge that the medical establishment's faith in bloodletting was beginning to waver. By the 1840s, progressive doctors were questioning whether draining patients' blood was actually therapeutic or just an elaborate form of sanctioned assault. Thomas could see the writing on the wall, written in increasingly smaller orders from apothecaries and declining prices for his blood-sucking inventory. The decline of medical bloodletting didn't happen overnight, but rather through a gradual process that felt like watching his entire industry slowly bleed to death, which was particularly appropriate given the circumstances. Doctors began prescribing leeches less frequently, and when they did, they often used smaller quantities. Where a physician might once have ordered 50 leeches for a single treatment, they now prescribed 10 or 15, claiming they were practicing more refined medicine. Thomas watched his income shrink year by year, while his expenses remained constant. The cost of maintaining collecting equipment, transportation to markets, and basic living expenses didn't decrease just because fewer people wanted to purchase blood-sucking worms. He tried expanding his territory, venturing into more remote wetlands in search of untapped leech populations, but this only increased his expenses while providing diminishing returns. The competition among collectors became increasingly fierce as the market contracted. Territorial disputes that had once been settled through gentlemanly agreements now escalated into actual violence. Thomas found himself involved in what could only be described as the world's most pathetic turf wars, fighting other desperate men for the right to be bitten by leeches in specific marshlands. These conflicts rarely involved actual weapons, but rather took the form of sabotage, theft, and occasional shoving matches between anemic men who barely had the strength to harm each other effectively. The social dynamics of the leech collecting community began to deteriorate as economic pressure mounted. Veteran collectors hoarded information about productive sites, forming secretive partnerships that excluded newcomers and struggling operators. Thomas found himself increasingly isolated, unable to afford membership in the informal cartels that controlled the most lucrative territories. He attempted to modernize his operation by experimenting with artificial breeding, constructing wooden tanks in his backyard where he hoped to cultivate leeches in controlled conditions. The experiment was a disaster of epic proportions. Leeches, it turned out, had specific breeding requirements that weren't easily replicated in wooden boxes behind a tenant cottage. The creatures either died from improper water conditions, escaped through gaps in the tank construction, or simply refused to reproduce in captivity. Thomas lost his entire investment, along with several weeks' worth of collected specimens that he had hoped to use as breeding stock. The failure of his breeding program forced Thomas to confront the reality that he was trapped in a dying industry with no viable alternatives. His entire adult life had been spent developing expertise in a field that was rapidly becoming obsolete, and his chronic health problems made it difficult to transition to other forms of manual labor. He was, in essence, a highly specialized professional in a profession that was ceasing to exist. The final blow came in 1847, when Jeremiah Blackwood announced that he was discontinuing his leech purchasing program. The apothecary had found more reliable suppliers in London, who could provide imported leeches at lower prices than local collectors could match. Foreign leeches, primarily from Eastern Europe, were flooding the English market, collected by peasants who were willing to work for wages that would have been insulting even to someone accustomed to being paid in blood-sucking invertebrates. Thomas made a desperate attempt to reach London markets directly, loading his remaining leech inventory into portable tanks and making the journey to the capital. The trip was a disaster from beginning to end. Half the leeches died during transportation due to inadequate water conditions and temperature fluctuations. The surviving specimens were rejected by London suppliers, who claimed they were inferior to imported varieties. Thomas returned home with empty tanks, depleted savings, and the growing realization that his career in professional bloodletting was effectively over. The transition away from leech collecting was brutal for someone whose entire identity had been built around enduring biological exploitation. Thomas attempted various forms of employment, but his chronic anemia and damaged health made sustained physical labor nearly impossible. His scarred legs, once badges of professional dedication, now served as permanent reminders of years spent in service to a medical practice that was rapidly being recognized as barbaric nonsense. He briefly considered emigrating to America, where he heard that bloodletting was still popular among frontier physicians who hadn't yet caught up with European medical progress. But the cost of passage was beyond his means, and the prospect of starting over in a new country while suffering from chronic health problems seemed more terrifying than profitable. Thomas eventually found work as a night soil man, collecting human waste from outdoor privies for sale as agricultural fertilizer. It was, remarkably, a step down from leech collecting, both in terms of social status and olfactory experience. At least leeches were living creatures with some biological dignity. Night soil was just excrement with a euphemistic name. But the work paid regularly and didn't require him to sacrifice his own blood, which felt like progress of a sort. The irony of Thomas's career trajectory wasn't lost on him. He had spent his productive years literally feeding parasites with his own body, and now he was handling the waste products of a society that had moved beyond the need for his biological services. There was a certain poetic justice in the progression, though Thomas was too exhausted and anemic to fully appreciate the literary symbolism. As the 1850s progressed, the remaining leech collectors formed a sort of informal support group, united by their shared experience of professional obsolescence and chronic blood loss. They would gather in taverns, sharing stories of their glory days, when doctors couldn't get enough blood-sucking worms, and commiserating about their current circumstances. These meetings had the melancholy atmosphere of veterans reminiscing about a war that everyone else had forgotten. Except their war had been against their own circulatory systems. The health consequences of years in the leech collecting business became increasingly apparent as Thomas aged. His circulation never fully recovered from decades of regular blood loss, leaving him with persistent fatigue and susceptibility to cold. The scars on his legs became sites of chronic infection, requiring regular treatment with remedies that were ironically more effective than the bloodletting he had once supported through his biological sacrifices. Thomas lived to see the complete collapse of the medicinal leech industry in England. watching as the last commercial suppliers closed their operations or transitioned to other forms of medical equipment. The marshlands where he had once harvested bloodsuckers were drained for agricultural use or industrial development, erasing the physical evidence of an entire profession that had once sustained hundreds of families. In his final years, Thomas became something of a local curiosity. One of the last surviving practitioners of a trade that seemed incredibly barbaric to younger generations who had grown up with more sophisticated medical practices. Children would stare at his scarred legs with fascination and horror, unable to comprehend why anyone would voluntarily allow themselves to be consumed by parasites. He died in 1873 at the age of 50, his death certificate listing the cause as complications from chronic anemia and respiratory infection. The attending physician was a young man who had been trained in the new scientific medicine, with no understanding of bloodletting beyond its historical curiosity. Thomas's funeral was attended by fewer than a dozen people, mostly other former leech collectors who had survived the transition to other forms of employment. The leech collecting industry left no monuments, no historical markers, no recognition of the men who had literally bled for the advancement of medical science, however misguided that science might have been. The marshlands were drained, the collection sites forgotten, and the specialized knowledge of bloodsucker procurement died with the last practitioners. Modern medical historians occasionally mention leech collectors as a footnote in the history of bloodletting, but they rarely dwell on the human cost of the practice. The men who stood in swamps being systematically drained by parasites are remembered, if at all, as curious relics of a more primitive time, rather than as individuals who suffered genuine hardship in service to their society's medical beliefs. Yet there's something to be said for the dedication of men like Thomas Whitmore, who spent their lives enduring biological exploitation because they believed they were contributing to human health and welfare. They were wrong about the medical value of their work, but they were genuinely committed to their profession, even when that profession involved being slowly consumed by aquatic worms. The story of Victorian leech collecting serves as a reminder that progress often comes at the expense of individuals who dedicate their lives to practices that later generations recognize as misguided. Thomas and his fellow collectors were casualties of medical advancement, men whose specialized skills became obsolete as scientific understanding improved. In the end, Thomas Whitmore's life exemplified the cruel irony of being professionally devoted to a practice that was literally and figuratively draining. He gave his blood, his health, and ultimately his life to an industry that existed solely to extract blood from others. It was a career built on the fundamental principle of biological exploitation, and perhaps it's fitting that the industry ultimately consumed its own practitioners just as thoroughly as the leeches consumed their hosts. The marshlands of Lincolnshire are peaceful now, home to birds and wildlife rather than desperate men seeking blood-sucking invertebrates. The water runs cleaner, the air smells better, and no one stands waist deep in stagnant ponds waiting to be bitten by parasites. It's a vast improvement over the Victorian era, when medical science was confident that the best treatment for most ailments involved the systematic removal of the patient's blood by hungry worms. But somewhere in those quiet wetlands, if you know where to look, you can still find leeches going about their ancient business of blood consumption, blissfully unaware that they once supported an entire industry of human misery. They continue their parasitic existence, no longer burdened with the responsibility of curing human ailments or supporting desperate collectors, simply being leeches in the most fundamental sense of the word. Thomas Whitmore and his fellow collectors are gone now, their sacrifices forgotten, their scars healed by death, their stories reduced to footnotes in medical history. They were the last practitioners of a profession that modern people can barely comprehend, men who chose to be systematically consumed by parasites because someone convinced them it was useful work. Perhaps that's the most fitting epitaph for the leech collecting industry. It was useful work, performed by dedicated professionals, right up until the moment when everyone realized it was completely useless. And by then, the men who had bled for it had already given everything they had to give. The legacy of leech collecting extends beyond the individual tragedies of men like Thomas Whitmore. It represents a broader pattern in human civilization, where entire populations dedicate themselves to practices that later generations view as not merely obsolete, but actively harmful. The Victorian era was particularly rich with such professions, from phrenologists measuring skull bumps to determine personality traits, to resurrection men digging up corpses for medical schools, to the countless individuals who made their living from the elaborate machinery of human suffering that characterized 19th century medicine. What distinguished leech collectors from other questionable Victorian professions was the direct, personal nature of their sacrifice. A phrenologist might be wrong about the significance of cranial measurements, but he wasn't required to damage his own skull in the process. A patent medicine salesman might peddle useless remedies, but he didn't have to consume them himself. Leech collectors, however, were both the means of production and the raw material, their own bodies serving as both factory and inventory in an economy of biological exploitation. The psychological profile of men who chose this profession reveals fascinating insights into human adaptability and desperation. These weren't individuals who stumbled into leech collecting by accident or misunderstanding. They made deliberate choices to endure regular blood loss, knowing full well the physical and social consequences. What drove such decisions was usually a combination of limited alternatives, family tradition, and the sort of fatalistic acceptance that characterized much of working-class life in industrial Britain. Thomas's contemporary, William Marsh, represented another variation on the leech collector archetype. Where Thomas had inherited the profession, William had actively chosen it after failing as an agricultural labourer. William was a man of unusual philosophical bent for someone who spent his days being consumed by parasites. He had taught himself to read, and often brought books to the marshlands, reading between collecting sessions, while his latest crop of leeches fed on his blood. William's approach to the profession was almost scholarly in its thoroughness. He maintained detailed records of leech behaviour, water conditions, and seasonal variations in productivity. His notebooks, discovered years after his death, contained observations that would have impressed professional naturalists. He documented the feeding patterns of different leech species, their reproductive cycles, and their responses to environmental changes with the precision of a trained scientist. But William's intellectual approach to leech collecting couldn't protect him from its physical demands. If anything, his analytical mind made the experience worse by providing him with a clear understanding of exactly what was happening to his body during each collecting session. He could calculate with mathematical precision how much blood he was losing, estimate his recovery time, and predict the long-term health consequences of his career choices. Knowledge, in this case, was definitely not power. The relationship between leech collectors and the medical establishment was complex and largely one-sided. Doctors relied completely on the steady supply of bloodsuckers provided by collectors, but they rarely acknowledged the human cost of their therapeutic preferences. Medical journals of the period contain extensive discussions of leech application techniques, proper storage methods, and therapeutic applications, but virtually no mention of the men who risked their health to maintain the supply chain. This willful blindness extended to the broader society. Respectable Victorian families might keep jars of leeches in their medicine cabinets for treating various ailments, but they preferred not to think about how those leeches were obtained. It was easier to imagine that blood-sucking worms appeared spontaneously in apothecary shops, rather than acknowledging that real human beings stood in swamps being systematically drained to supply the medical trade. The economic structure of the leech industry was deliberately designed to isolate collectors from their end customers. The multi-tiered system of collectors, dealers, apothecaries, and physicians ensured that no one had to confront the full reality of the trade. Collectors sold to local dealers, who sold to regional suppliers, who sold to apothecaries, who sold to doctors, who applied the leeches to patients. Each level of the supply chain could maintain plausible deniability about the human cost of their commercial activities. Thomas's relationship with his father William represented a particularly tragic aspect of the leech collecting culture. The elder Whitmore had spent his entire adult life in the trade, watching his health deteriorate year by year, his body accumulate scars, his energy levels decline from chronic blood loss. Yet when his son reached working age, William didn't hesitate to introduce him to the same life of biological exploitation that had consumed his own vitality. This wasn't cruelty or indifference on William's part, but rather a reflection of the limited options available to working-class families in Victorian England. The leech collecting trade, however miserable, provided a relatively stable income compared to agricultural labour or factory work. It was a skill that could be passed down through generations, creating a form of job security that was rare in an era of rapid economic change. The training process for new leech collectors was brutal in its simplicity. There were no apprenticeship programs, no gradual introduction to the profession, no protective equipment or safety protocols. Father simply brought son to the marsh, explained the basic technique, and watched as the young man learned through direct experience what it meant to be systematically consumed by aquatic parasites. Thomas's first collecting season was a masterclass in occupational horror that extended far beyond his initial day in Grimsby Marsh. Each morning brought new lessons in discomfort, new discoveries about the limits of human endurance, and new insights into the creative ways that blood-sucking invertebrates could make a person's life miserable. The variety of leech species in English wetlands meant that Thomas had to learn to identify his tormentors by the sensation of their bites. Hirudo medicinalis, the prized medicinal leech, had a relatively gentle bite and fed steadily without causing excessive irritation. Horse leeches were larger and more aggressive, often leaving deeper wounds that took longer to heal. Smaller species might be less valuable commercially, but they compensated for their size by attacking in greater numbers, creating a sort of biological carpet bombing effect on the collector's legs. Beyond the direct effects of leech feeding, Thomas had to contend with the secondary infections that inevitably followed. Open wounds, constantly exposed to stagnant marsh water, were perfect breeding grounds for bacteria, and even minor bites could develop into serious infections if not properly treated. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was supplying leeches to treat other people's ailments, while simultaneously suffering from medical problems caused by his profession. The seasonal rhythms of leech collecting created a bizarre annual cycle of recovery and renewed suffering. Spring brought both hope and dread as Thomas prepared for another season of biological exploitation. Summer represented the peak earning period, when warm weather made leeches most active and medical demand reached its highest levels. Autumn was a time of physical and financial accounting, calculating the year's profits against the year's physical costs. Winter offered respite from active collecting, but brought its own hardships as Thomas struggled to maintain his health and income during the off-season. The social isolation experienced by leech collectors extended beyond their immediate families into the broader community structure. Churches were uncomfortable with parishioners whose profession involved deliberately allowing themselves to be consumed by creatures that biblical tradition associated with corruption and decay. Taverns tolerated leech collectors as customers, but often segregated them from other patrons due to their distinctive odor and appearance. Even other working-class professions looked down on leech collecting as unnecessarily degrading. This social exclusion created a tight, knit community among collectors themselves, bound together by their shared experience of occupational misery. They developed their own culture, complete with specialized terminology, professional rituals, and informal codes of conduct. The language of leech collecting was rich with technical terms that would have been incomprehensible to outsiders. Blooding, for a successful collecting session. Drying, for periods of low leech activity, marked, for legs bearing the distinctive scars of veteran collectors. The professional rituals included elaborate preparations before entering marshlands, techniques for managing pain during feeding sessions, and recovery protocols for maximizing healing between collections. These weren't superstitions but rather practical knowledge, accumulated through generations of biological exploitation, passed down through informal networks of practitioners who understood that their survival depended on sharing information about how to endure systematic consumption by parasites. The informal codes of conduct governed everything from territorial boundaries to pricing agreements to mutual aid during medical emergencies. Leech collectors might compete fiercely for productive sites, but they also maintained a system of mutual support that recognized their shared vulnerability. A collector who collapsed from blood loss could count on assistance from competitors who understood that they might need similar help themselves. Thomas's education in these cultural norms came through painful experience and occasional guidance from veteran collectors who took pity on obvious newcomers. He learned which marshlands were considered open territory and which were jealously guarded by established practitioners. He discovered the informal pricing agreements that prevented destructive competition and the mutual aid networks that provided support during medical emergencies or family crises. The technical aspects of leech collecting required skills that would have impressed professional naturalists if professional naturalists had been willing to acknowledge the expertise of men who stood in swamps being eaten by invertebrates. Collectors had to understand leech behavior, water chemistry, seasonal migration patterns, and environmental factors that affected productivity. They became expert at reading wetland ecosystems, identifying optimal collecting sites, and predicting the success of individual sessions based on weather conditions and seasonal factors. Thomas developed an almost supernatural ability to locate productive leech populations by subtle environmental cues that would have been invisible to casual observers. The color and clarity of water, the types of vegetation growing along shorelines, the presence or absence of certain bird species, the temperature and flow patterns of streams feeding into marshlands, all of these factors influenced leech distribution and activity levels. But perhaps the most demanding skill was pain management. Leech collecting required the ability to ignore intense discomfort while maintaining the concentration necessary for safe and productive work. Collectors developed personal techniques for managing the psychological stress of being systematically consumed, ranging from mental distraction exercises to philosophical acceptance of their biological role as human feeding stations. The pain wasn't limited to the immediate sensation of leech feeding. The aftermath of each collecting session brought its own catalogue of misery-throbbing wounds, persistent bleeding, muscle fatigue from standing motionless in water for hours, and the psychological exhaustion of enduring biological exploitation. Thomas learned to view these sensations as occupational hazards rather than medical emergencies, developing a tolerance for discomfort that would have alarmed medical professionals if any medical professionals had bothered to examine leech collectors. The long-term health consequences became apparent gradually, accumulating over years of regular blood loss and exposure to contaminated water. Thomas's circulation never fully adapted to the regular drainage imposed by his profession, leaving him with persistent fatigue and susceptibility to cold weather that made winter employment particularly challenging. His immune system, weakened by chronic stress and blood loss, made him vulnerable to every infectious disease that circulated through the working-class neighborhoods where he lived. The scars accumulated like a living record of his professional dedication, creating patterns on his legs that told the story of decades spent in service to blood-sucking invertebrates. Each mark represented hours of patient suffering, individual leeches that had fed on his blood, specific collecting sessions that had contributed to his family's survival. The scars were both badges of professional competence and evidence of the physical price he had paid for his expertise. As medical fashion began to shift away from bloodletting in the 1840s and 1850s, Thomas found himself in the position of a highly skilled professional whose skills were rapidly becoming obsolete. His expertise in leech behavior, his knowledge of wetland ecosystems, his tolerance for biological exploitation, none of these abilities had any application outside the narrow field of bloodsucker procurement. The decline wasn't sudden enough to allow for easy career transitions. Instead, it was a gradual erosion of demand that left collectors like Thomas trapped between a dying profession and the impossibility of starting over in new fields. Their chronic health problems made physical labor difficult, their social isolation limited their access to alternative employment networks, and their specialized knowledge had no transfer value to other industries. Thomas's attempts to diversify his income through related activities met with limited success. He tried collecting other aquatic creatures for medical purposes. Freshwater mussels were sometimes used in folk remedies, and certain water plants had commercial value, but these markets were small and already served by established suppliers. His marsh, walking skills might have qualified him for work as a fowler or fisherman, but his weakened condition made such physically demanding work impractical. The final years of the leech collecting industry were characterized by increasing desperation among practitioners who could see their profession disappearing but couldn't afford to abandon it. Prices continued to decline as medical demand decreased, forcing collectors to work longer hours and take greater risks to maintain their income levels. Thomas found himself venturing into more remote and dangerous marshlands, accepting lower prices from dealers and extending his collecting seasons into weather conditions that would have been considered unsuitable in earlier years. The community of collectors began to fragment as economic pressure mounted. The mutual support networks that had sustained the profession through previous difficulties broke down under the stress of declining income and increasing competition for shrinking markets. Professional relationships that had been maintained for decades dissolved into bitter disputes over territory, pricing, and access to the few remaining profitable sites. Thomas watched his father's generation of collectors disappear one by one, some dying from the accumulated health effects of their profession, others abandoning the trade for whatever alternative employment they could find. The knowledge and culture that had sustained leech collecting for generations was being lost as practitioners left the field without passing their expertise to successors who might never need it. The end came not with dramatic collapse, but with quiet dissolution. Orders from apothecaries became smaller and less frequent, prices dropped below sustainable levels, and collectors gradually found other ways to survive. Thomas's last commercial collecting session took place in the spring of 1849, when he stood in a familiar marsh for what he didn't know would be the final time, allowing leeches to feed on his blood in service of a medical practice that was already being abandoned by progressive physicians. He had become a relic of medical history while still actively practicing his profession, a living representative of therapeutic approaches that enlightened doctors were beginning to recognize as barbaric. The leeches he collected that day were probably among the last to be used for medical bloodletting in his region, marking the end of a commercial relationship between humans and parasites that had persisted for centuries. The transition away from leech collecting was particularly difficult for men like Thomas, who had dedicated their entire adult lives to the profession. Unlike workers in other declining industries who might transfer their skills to related fields, leech collectors possessed expertise that had no application outside their narrow specialty. They were left with damaged health, limited financial resources, and skills that the modern world no longer needed. Thomas's story ended as it had begun, with blood and water and the stubborn persistence of creatures that continued their ancient work of parasitism long after humans had stopped finding commercial uses for their services. He died knowing that his life's work had been rendered obsolete by medical progress, but also knowing that he had performed it with dedication and skill under conditions that would have broken weaker men. The marshlands where he had spent his career returned to their natural state, populated once again by wildlife rather than desperate humans seeking biological exploitation. The leeches remained, of course, continuing their timeless existence as aquatic parasites, blissfully unaware that they had once been valuable enough to support an entire industry of human suffering. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of the leech collecting trade, that progress sometimes requires the complete obsolescence of entire ways of life, leaving behind only scars and stories and the persistent memory of men who bled for beliefs that turned out to be wrong.